The sun hangs low in the sky over the Roncevaux Pass, its dying light painting the rocky crags in shades of blood and fire. The narrow passage, once peaceful, now echoes with the cacophony of battle, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of the wounded and dying, the war cries of Frankish knights and Basque warriors alike. Atop a small hill, Roland, the greatest of Charlemagne's paladins, stands like a statue hewn from granite. His once gleaming armor is dented and stained with blood, both his own and that of his enemies. Durandal, his legendary sword, glows red in the fading light, as if it has drunk deep of the day's bloodshed and yearns for more. Roland's piercing gaze sweeps across the battlefield, taking in the chaos below. He sees his fellow knights, men he's fought beside for years, falling one by one under the relentless Basque assault. The sheer number of the enemy is overwhelming for everyone that falls. 3 more seem to take their place. As he watches, Roland's mind races. He replays the events that led them here, the long march through the Pyrenees, the promise of glory in Spain, the fateful decision to split their forces. He remembers the argument with Ganelon, his stepfather, whose advice to Charlemagne had placed Roland and the rear guard in this precarious position. Was it truly strategic necessity, or had Ganelon's jealousy finally found its outlet? The weight of leadership presses down on Roland like a physical force. Every decision he's made has led to this moment. His pride, his unwavering belief in the strength of his men, his desire to prove himself worthy of Charlemagne's trust, all of it has brought them to the edge of annihilation. A familiar voice cuts through the din of battle. Roland. It's Oliver, his closest friend and fellow paladin, fighting tirelessly nearby. We cannot hold much longer. Roland grips Durandal tighter, the leather of his gauntlets creaking. He knows Oliver speaks the truth. Their situation is dire, perhaps beyond salvation. Yet, the thought of admitting defeat, of calling for help like some green squire, overwhelmed by his first skirmish, makes Roland's jaw clench in frustration. But as he watches more of his men fall, as he sees the fear and desperation in the eyes of even his bravest knights, something within Roland begins to change. The ironclad edifice of his pride begins to crack. He thinks of Charlemagne, the man who raised him, who trusted him with this crucial task. He thinks of France, of the green fields and soaring cathedrals they left behind. He thinks of Aude, Oliver's sister, and his betrothed, waiting for a return that may never come. In this moment, as the battle hangs in the balance, Roland makes his decision. It's not a choice between victory and defeat. That die has already been cast. No, this is a choice between pride and duty, between personal glory and the lives of his men. Roland takes a deep breath, tasting blood and smoke on the air. He knows that what he's about to do will forever change how he's remembered. No longer the invincible paladin, but the leader who waited too long, who let his pride overcome his judgment. But he also knows it's the right choice, the only choice. With a heavy heart but a clear mind, Roland turns to Oliver. Their eyes meet across the chaos of the battlefield, a lifetime of friendship and shared battles passing between them in an instant. Roland gives a simple nod, and he sees understanding dawn in Oliver's eyes, relief mingled with sorrow, knowing what this decision will cost his friend. Roland reaches for the elephant, the ivory horn that hangs at his side. As his fingers close around it, he feels the weight of destiny shifting. The battle for Roncevaux Pass is lost, but perhaps, just perhaps, something may yet be salvaged from this day of blood and sorrow. The decision made, Roland's world narrows to the Oliphant at his side. The ornate horn, a gift from Charlemagne himself, feels heavier than ever before. It's not just the physical weight, but the weight of what it represents: a call for help, an admission of failure. Roland's mind drifts back to earlier that day, to the heated argument with Oliver. His friend's words echo in his memory. "Roland, we are outnumbered. We must call for aid." But Roland, filled with pride and the unshakable belief in their invincibility, had refused. "I will not have it said that I sounded my horn for heathen rabble," he had declared. Now, as the sun sinks lower and the shadows of defeat loom larger, Roland sees the folly of his earlier pride. He watches Oliver fighting nearby, his friend's armor dented and bloodied, yet still he fights on. Oliver, who had the wisdom to see their peril, who had the courage to challenge Roland's decision. Roland catches Oliver's eye across the battlefield. In that moment, a lifetime of friendship passes between them. Childhood games in Aix-la-Chapelle, their first battles together, countless nights around campfires, sharing dreams of glory and honor. Roland sees in Oliver's gaze not judgment or reproach, but understanding and a deep, abiding loyalty. With a nod to Oliver, Roland acknowledges the truth of his friend's earlier words. He sees relief wash over Oliver's face, quickly replaced by grim determination. They both know what this decision means, that even if help comes, it will likely be too late for them. But perhaps, just perhaps, their sacrifice might yet save others. As Roland reaches for the elephant, he feels the eyes of his remaining men upon him. These brave knights, who have followed him unquestioningly into this deadly trap, who have fought and bled and died at his command. He owes them this last chance, however slim, at salvation. Roland's hand closes around the horn, feeling the smooth ivory under his bloodied gauntlet. The intricate carvings tell the story of Charlemagne's victories, of the might of the Frankish Empire. Will this day be remembered as the end of that story, or merely another chapter? With the Oliphant in his grasp, Roland feels a strange sense of peace settle over him. The chaos of the battle seems to recede, the screams and clashing of steel fading to a distant roar. In this moment of clarity, Roland knows that whatever happens next, he has made the right choice. Not for himself, but for his men, for Charlemagne, for France. He brings the horn to his lips, tasting blood and dust. Roland takes a deep breath, preparing to sound the call that will echo through history. In this moment, he is no longer just Roland the Paladin, but Roland the legend, the hero who will be remembered in song and story for generations to come. The horn trembles against his lips, and then, with all the strength left in his battered body, Roland blows. As Roland's lips meet the elephant, time seems to slow. In the heartbeat before he blows, his mind races through the implications of this act. The horn is more than just an instrument. It's a lifeline to Charlemagne and the main army, a last desperate plea for salvation. Roland knows the capabilities of this horn intimately. It's not merely a battle signal, but a magical artifact, imbued with power by Charlemagne's court sorcerers. Its call can traverse mountains and valleys, carried by winds both natural and mystical. If blown with enough force and desperation, it could reach Charlemagne's ears, even leagues away. As he prepares to blow, Roland visualizes the path the sound will take. From the blood-soaked Roncevaux Pass, it will echo off the towering peaks of the Pyrenees. It will race down valleys and across plateaus, startling wildlife and causing peasants to look up in wonder. And finally, if fate is kind, it will reach the ears of Charlemagne himself. Roland imagines Charlemagne's reaction. The emperor, his foster father and liege lord, would recognize the sound instantly. How many times had Charlemagne joked that he could pick out Roland's horn call from 1,000 others? The emperor would know immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. He would understand that his most trusted paladin, the undefeated Roland, was calling for aid. But even as hope flares in Roland's chest, doubt gnaws at him. How far has Charlemagne's army marched? Are they still within range of the elephant's call? And even if they hear it, how long would it take them to return through the treacherous mountain passes? Roland pushes these doubts aside. He has to believe that help will come, that Charlemagne will hear and understand. He has to give his remaining men this last chance at survival. As he steadies himself to blow, Roland also knows that this call will alert every Basque warrior in the region to their exact location. It's a double-edged sword, a cry for help that will also bring down the full fury of their enemies upon them. But there's no turning back now. Roland has made his decision, late though it may be. He will sound the horn, and in doing so, he will write the final chapter of this battle. Whether it ends in miraculous rescue or glorious last stand, it will be a tale worthy of the greatest bards. With iron determination, Roland takes a deep breath. He thinks of Charlemagne, of Oliver, of all his brave knights. He thinks of France, of honor, of duty. And with all these thoughts swirling in his mind, with the fate of his men and the future of an empire hanging in the balance, Roland blows the olifant with all his might. As Roland brings the olifant to his lips, the true toll of the battle suddenly crashes over him like a physical wave. His arms, which have swung Durandal tirelessly for hours, now tremble with exhaustion. The horn, once light in his hands, now feels as heavy as a millstone. Roland staggers, his feet unsteady on the blood-slick ground. The world spins around him, and for a moment he fears he might fall. The realization of his own mortality, of the limits of even his legendary endurance, hits him with brutal force. He looks down at himself, truly seeing his condition for the first time. His armor, the finest crafted in all of Christendom, is battered beyond recognition. Blood seeps from a dozen wounds, some shallow, others worryingly deep. Each breath sends a spike of pain through his ribs, broken or cracked. He can't tell. Roland blinks hard, trying to clear the fog from his vision. He tastes blood in his mouth, feels it trickling down his face from a gash above his eye. How much blood has he lost? How much strength remains to him? As he struggles with the horn, Roland becomes acutely aware of his surroundings. The sounds of battle seem muffled, as if coming from a great distance. He sees his remaining knights forming a protective circle around him, understanding the crucial importance of this moment. Their faces are etched with exhaustion and fear, but also with unwavering loyalty. Oliver fights his way to Roland's side, his own armor in no better condition. "Brother," he says, his voice hoarse from shouting battle cries, "let me help you." Roland wants to refuse, to insist that he can do this alone. But he knows that now is not the time for pride. He nods gratefully to his friend. Together, Roland and Oliver lift the olifant. The simple act of raising the horn takes every ounce of strength Roland has left. His arms shake, his vision blurs, but still he perseveres. He will not fail now, not when they've come so far, sacrificed so much. As they struggle with the horn, Roland looks at the faces of his men. He sees their fatigue, their wounds, their fear. But he also sees their determination, their unbreakable spirit. These men have followed him into hell itself, trusting in his leadership, believing in his invincibility. Their faith in him, even now at the brink of disaster, gives Roland a final surge of strength. With a monumental effort, ignoring the screaming protest of his battered body, Roland lifts the horn to his lips. In this moment, as he prepares to sound the call that will echo through history, Roland is more than just a man. He is a symbol of courage, of loyalty, of the indomitable human spirit. Whatever happens next, this image Roland, bloodied but unbowed, raising the olifant in defiance of fate itself, will live forever in the annals of legend. Roland takes a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs to capacity despite the stabbing pain in his ribs. Then, with every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he blows into the olifant. The sound that emerges is unlike anything the warriors have ever heard before. It starts low and mournful, a dirge for the fallen. But it quickly rises, becoming a piercing cry that seems to shake the very foundations of the mountains. The battlefield falls silent for a moment, both Franks and Basques stunned by the powerful sound. It's as if the horn's call has frozen time itself, suspending the chaos of battle in a single, eternal moment. The note holds, carrying over the battlefield, through the pass, and into the valleys beyond. Roland pours everything into this call: his strength, his regret, his plea for help, and his warning to Charlemagne. It's more than just a signal, it's Roland's very soul-given voice, a last defiant shout against the encroaching darkness. As Roland blows, the elephant begins to glow with an unearthly light. The magic imbued in the horn by Charlemagne's sorcerers awakens, amplifying the sound and carrying it far beyond the limits of mortal breath. The sound echoes off the rocky cliffs of the Pyrenees, amplifying and carrying even further. Birds take flight, startled by the noise. In distant villages, people look up in wonder and fear at the unearthly sound, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. Roland's knights, hearing the power in the call, find new strength. They stand taller, grip their weapons tighter, ready to fight to the last to protect their leader in this crucial moment. The Basques, on the other hand, are filled with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Some cover their ears, unable to bear the sound. Others back away, as if the horn's call itself were a physical force pushing them back. As the sound reverberates through the mountains, it begins to change the very landscape. Small avalanches of snow and rock cascade down distant peaks. The clouds above swirl and part, as if the horn's call were commanding the very heavens. Roland blows until his lungs are empty, the last of the air escaping in a final, fading note. But before the echo of the first call has even died away, he takes another deep breath. Ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the very limits of his mortal frame, Roland puts the horn to his lips once more. Again and again he blows, each call more desperate, more powerful than the last. Roland is no longer thinking of survival or victory. His entire existence has narrowed to this one task: to make sure his call is heard, to warn Charlemagne, to give his sacrifice meaning. In this moment, Roland transcends his mortal limits. He becomes legend incarnate, his defiant call echoing not just through the Pyrenees, but through the corridors of history itself. Miles away, in the vanguard of the Frankish army, Charlemagne rides at the head of his troops. The great emperor, his beard flowing white over his armor, cuts an imposing figure atop his massive warhorse. His mind is already turning to the battles ahead in Spain, to the glory and conquest that await. Suddenly, a faint sound reaches his ears, barely perceptible above the noise of the marching army. Charlemagne reins in his horse, holding up a hand to halt the troops. The sudden silence is deafening as thousands of men come to an abrupt stop, the clanking of armor and weapons fading to nothing. Charlemagne cocks his head, listening intently. There it is, again, a sound carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable. The emperor's face, usually an impassive mask of authority, suddenly pales. He recognizes that sound. It's the elephant Roland's horn. In an instant, Charlemagne's mind races through the implications. He knows Roland, knows his foster son's pride and bravery. Roland would never blow the horn unless the situation was truly dire, unless all hope was lost. The emperor's heart clenches with a fear he hasn't felt in decades. "Roland," Charlemagne whispers, his voice thick with emotion. Then louder, to his startled generals, "It's Roland." He calls for aid. The emperor's words send a ripple of shock through the assembled army. Roland, the invincible paladin? Roland, calling for help? Charlemagne's mind races, calculating distances and time. How far have they come? How long would it take to return through the treacherous mountain passes? Even as he thinks, he knows in his heart that it may already be too late. But Charlemagne is not a man to hesitate. With a voice that has commanded armies and shaped the fate of Europe, he bellows out orders. Turn back. All units, turn back. We ride for Roncevaux Pass. The army explodes into action. Horses wheel around, infantry formations pivot, the entire massive force changing direction, like a great ship turning in the sea. Charlemagne spurs his horse, taking the lead, pushing his mount to its limits. As they ride, the sound of the horn grows fainter, then stops altogether. The silence that follows is more terrifying to Charlemagne than any battle cry. He drives his forces mercilessly, knowing that every second counts. But even as they race back through the mountains, Charlemagne is haunted by doubt. Will they be in time? Or are they riding to avenge the dead rather than save the living? As Roland lowered the oliphant from his lips, the last echoes of its call faded away among the mountains. For a moment, hope flared in the hearts of the Frankish knights. Surely, Charlemagne must have heard. Surely help must be on the way. But the moment passed, and the brutal reality of their situation reasserted itself. The Basque forces, momentarily stunned by the horn's call, now pressed their attack with renewed vigor. They understood the significance of Roland's action. They knew they must finish the battle before reinforcements could arrive. Roland and his remaining men formed a tight circle, fighting back to back. Durendal flashed in the fading light as Roland cut down foe after foe. But for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to take their place. The Frankish knights, already exhausted from hours of fighting, began to falter. Oliver fought his way to Roland's side. "We've done what we can," he shouted over the din of battle. "But I fear it's too late, my friend." Roland nodded grimly, knowing Oliver spoke the truth. Even if Charlemagne heard the call and turned back immediately, it would take hours for help to arrive. Hours they didn't have. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the bitter realization set in. They were truly alone, cut off from all hope of rescue. This narrow mountain pass would be their final resting place. Yet even in this darkest hour, Roland and his knights fought on. If this was to be their end, they would make it an end worthy of song and story. They would sell their lives dearly, ensuring that the tale of their last stand would echo through the ages. Roland took a moment to survey the battlefield around him. Everywhere his gaze fell, there were signs of death and destruction. The once peaceful Roncevaux Pass had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape. The ground was stained with blood, broken armor and weapons littered the field, and the bodies of Franks and Basques lay intermingled. The sight of it all weighed heavily on Roland's heart. This was the price of his foolishness. His pride had brought them to this. If only he had heeded Oliver's advice earlier, if only he had swallowed his pride and called for help sooner. But regret was useless now. Roland took a deep breath and readied himself for more fighting. He knew these brave knights were dying because of his mistake. The only thing he could do now was to fight alongside them until the end. "Fight on, brothers," Roland cried out. "Let our names be remembered forever." His words were met with a resounding cheer from the remaining knights. Even knowing their fate, they were still ready to follow Roland. This was true loyalty, the true spirit of chivalry. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, darkness fell over Roncevaux Pass. But the battle raged on. In the moonlight, swords and armor glinted, and the shouts of knights and the moans of the wounded filled the night air. Roland stood at the center of it all. With Durendal held high, he was like the eye of the storm. Enemies came at him in waves, but he stood unshaken. His sword gleamed silver in the moonlight, parrying attacks and delivering deadly blows. And so, the night wore on, and Roland and his knights continued to fight. They knew their fate, but they refused to accept it. Instead, they fought with all their might, determined to make their story one that would be remembered for eternity. As the battle wore on, the circle of Frankish defenders grew smaller and smaller. Roland fought like a man possessed, Durendal a blur of deadly motion as he cut down foe after foe. But even his legendary strength had its limits. One by one, Roland watched his comrades fall. Brave knights who had fought by his side for years, men he had shared meals with, laughed with, dreamed of glory with, now they lay still in the blood-soaked earth of Roncevaux Pass. Oliver, Roland's closest friend and most trusted lieutenant, fought nearby. But even Oliver's skill and courage could not overcome the overwhelming odds. Roland saw him take an arrow to the shoulder, then another to the leg. Still, Oliver fought on, his face a mask of grim determination. Then, in a moment that would haunt Roland for the rest of his days, he saw Oliver fall. A Basque warrior's axe found a gap in Oliver's armor, and the great knight crumpled to the ground. Oliver! Roland's anguished cry rose above the din of battle. He tried to fight his way to his fallen friend, but the press of enemies was too great. The sight of Oliver's fall gave Roland a moment of agonizing clarity. He looked around at the handful of knights still standing. These men, the pride of Charlemagne's army, the undefeated paladins, were being slaughtered. Bodies littered the ground, the pass running red with the blood of Franks and Basques alike. The beautiful banners of Charlemagne's army now lay trampled in the mud. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear. Roland felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. These men had followed him loyally, trusting in his leadership, and he had led them to their doom. The guilt was almost more than he could bear. Yet still, the remaining knights fought on. They knew there was no hope of victory, no chance of rescue, but they were determined to make their final moments count, to die as they had lived as heroes of France. Roland looked at the last of his comrades around him. Their armor was torn and blood-stained, but their eyes still burned with indomitable will. He remembered each of their names: Jerome, Gautier, Berenger. They were no longer mere knights. They were becoming legends. "Brothers," Roland called out, his voice hoarse with fatigue and emotion, but still strong. "Our final hour is upon us. But we are sons of France. We are knights of Charlemagne. Let our names be remembered forever." His words were met with a roar from the remaining knights. They did not fear death. They only wished for their deaths to have meaning. As the night deepened, the battle raged on. The number of Frankish knights continued to dwindle, but their courage never faltered. They fought to the last, each taking many enemies with them before they fell. Roland stood at the center of it all. He fought like a god of death incarnate. Durandal sang in his hands, each swing a prayer, each fallen enemy an offering. He was no longer fighting for victory, but for time for Charlemagne to secure the passes. Time for the tale of their last stand to become legend. And as the moon reached its zenith, Roland found himself alone, the last of Charlemagne's paladins still standing in Roncevaux Pass. With most of his comrades fallen, Roland knew his own end was near. The realization didn't fill him with fear, but with a strange sense of calm. He had led his men to this fate. Now he would share it with them. Roland thought of Charlemagne, of France, of all they had fought for. He could not change the outcome of this battle, but he could ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. With grim determination, Roland fought on. Each swing of Durandal became a prayer, each fallen enemy an offering. He was no longer fighting for victory, but for time for Charlemagne to secure the passes. Time for the tale of their last stand to become legend. Roland's body was failing him, his vision blurring from blood loss and exhaustion. His arms felt like lead, each movement an immense effort. But his spirit remained unbroken. In these final moments, Roland transcended his physical limitations. Becoming something more than mortal, he became legend incarnate. He rallied the last of his strength, ready to sell his life dearly. Roland knew that his actions now would echo through history. He would give the bards a tale to sing for generations to come. With a mighty roar, Roland charged into the thickest press of enemies. Durandal sang in his hands, cutting down Basque warriors left and right. In this final, glorious moment, Roland was the very embodiment of the warrior ideal: brave, selfless, unstoppable. Time seemed to slow for Roland. He became acutely aware of every detail around him: the glint of moonlight on blood-stained steel, the cries of the wounded and dying, the look of fear and awe in the eyes of his enemies. He felt the weight of history on his shoulders, knew that this moment would be remembered for centuries to come. Roland's mind raced with memories. He saw himself as a young boy, dreaming of knighthood. He remembered the day Charlemagne had knighted him, the pride in his foster father's eyes. He thought of Oliver, his sworn brother, now lying still on the battlefield. He thought of Aude, Oliver's sister, and his betrothed, waiting for a return that would never come. These thoughts didn't weaken Roland, they strengthened him. Each memory was a reason to fight on, to make this last stand worthy of the life he had lived. He was Roland, greatest of Charlemagne's paladins, and he would die as he had lived, with honor, with courage, with his sword in his hand. As the night wore on, Roland's strength began to fade. His movements, once swift and sure, became sluggish. But still, he fought on, defying his body's limits through sheer force of will. He would not fall, not yet. There was still more to do, still more enemies to take with him into death. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, Roland found himself alone. The last of his comrades had fallen, their bodies forming a protective ring around him. The Basque warriors approached cautiously, wary of the legendary paladin, even in his weakened state. Roland knew this was truly the end. With his remaining strength, he raised Durendal high, the blade catching the first rays of the rising sun. The sword had served him well, but now it was time for one final act. In a gesture of defiance and respect, Roland turned to a nearby boulder. With all his might, he brought Durendal down upon the rock, attempting to break the blade. He would not let his faithful sword fall into enemy hands. But Durendal, forged with holy relics and blessed by the Pope himself, did not break. Instead, it cleaved the boulder in two. Knowing he could do no more, Roland tucked Durendal into his belt. Then, in a final act of defiance and duty, he brought the oliphant to his lips once more. As the Basques closed in, Roland blew the horn with his dying breath. The sound that emerged was different from before, softer, mournful, a lament for the fallen and a farewell to the world. It spoke of bravery and sacrifice, of loyalty and love, of a life lived in service to a greater cause. The notes of the oliphant echoed through the pass, carried by the morning wind. It was a sound that would haunt the dreams of all who heard it, a sound that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. As Roland blew, he felt his life force ebbing away, but he also felt a sense of peace, of completion. He had done his duty. He had fought to the last. He had given everything for his emperor, his comrades, his country. With the last of his strength fading, Roland's mind turned to prayer. He asked for forgiveness for his sins, for mercy for his fallen comrades. He commended his soul to God and the souls of all who had fallen in Roncevaux Pass. As the final note faded, Roland fell to his knees. His last thoughts were of Charlemagne, of Oliver, of the green fields of France he would never see again. He saw Aude's face, beautiful and sorrowful, as if she already knew of their fate. And then, still clutching horn and sword, the great Roland fell. His physical form was no more, but his legend was born in that moment. Bards would sing of this day for centuries to come, of Roland and his brave companions, of their valiant last stand in Roncevaux Pass. In death, Roland became immortal, a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the indomitable spirit of France. His tale would inspire countless knights and heroes, his name whispered with reverence in halls and castles across Christendom. As the sun rose fully over Roncevaux Pass, it illuminated a scene of both tragedy and triumph. The bodies of the fallen lay where they had fought, Franks and Basques alike. But amidst the carnage, one figure stood out. Roland, even in death, seemed to radiate nobility and courage. And so ended the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, and so began the legend of Roland, a tale that would echo through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of heroism and sacrifice.